Phylum Annelida is another member of the protostomes. They're also sometimes called the segmented worms because they have this distinctive segmentation. And so they look like rings. This is a marine worm. You're probably more familiar with an earthworm that has this kind of structure. Segmentation occurs in other groups besides the annelids. So I just want to remind you that we see this, for example, in the chordates and in arthropods as well. In phylum Annelida, segmentation provides several advantages. The segments oftentimes are repetitive, and so if one segment isn't working, there's other segments that are carrying out the same function, and so you can have damage, for example, without loss of life. In the case of phylum Annelida, they have a hydrostatic skeleton. That means they don't have bones or anything rigid. They're a water-filled, their structure comes from being water-filled, and they squeeze that fluid in order to get movement. And so the segments actually help provide that squeezing motion for movement. And then the kind of third benefit is that segments can become specialized. And so when you have segments that's specialized, it's a little different of an evolutionary process and in some ways easier, if you will, to evolve. And so as segments specialize, you can build complexity in the body plan. So this marine worm here is also demonstrating setae. So all annelids except leeches have setae. There's these little appendages that stick off of each segment. They almost look like bristles. In marine worms, they're particularly prominent, which is why I have a marine worm pictured here. But earthworms also have them. They're just not as visible. They're much, much, much smaller. They reproduce sexually with two individuals. They are usually hermaphroditic, and they usually have internal fertilization. And so this is actually a picture of two earthworms mating. So hermaphrodites actually compete to deposit sperm in many cases. So it's whoever deposits sperm first sort of wins, for lack of a better word. And so why would that be? Well, if you think about it, the organism that ends up fertilized and having the fertilized eggs has more of a burden of energy than sperm depositing. And so it's preferred to be the one that deposited sperm, again, from an energy use standpoint. You may have heard that in some worms, if a piece of them breaks off, they can regenerate. And that's true in some species, but not all. There's two classes of annelids. Polychaeta is the marine worms. This is the largest group, so lots and lots and lots of ocean-dwelling worms. And these are the ones that have the long setae that we saw in the picture before. Clitellata includes earthworms or subclass Oligochaeta. So these are terrestrial and freshwater worms, so not living in the ocean. They're particularly significant for their role in conditioning soil through what are called worm castings. So that's basically worm poop. So they go through and they eat up debris that falls onto the soil, and they go up and they grab it, and then they dig and burrow deep into the soil and add organic matter to the soil. So they help build substantial soils and create pockets for airflow in the soil as well. And so they're super, super important for healthy soils. Subclass Hierodynia is the leeches. And here's a leech attaching to skin, and this demonstrates their role as external parasites. So they feed on the blood of other animals. And they do not have setae. Okay, phylum Rotifera, another protostome. The name rotifer refers to this ciliated crown here, or corona. There's a small number of species, 2,000. They mostly are in fresh water, so they're found in places like ponds. And this is their body plan. So they're microscopic, and when you look at this body, it probably doesn't look like any animal you're familiar with because you've never seen one without a microscope. But I just want to point out that there are organs inside of here, a stomach, a primitive kidney. There is a complete digestive system, a brain, an eye spot. So again, even though it doesn't feel like a familiar animal, it does have animal traits. And so I want to go ahead and actually bring you over to a video, just a short video here, showing a rotifer in action. So there's its ciliated crown opening up. That's pulling food into its mouth right here. See that one more time. And we can see all the organs and pieces inside here. And again, remembering that this is using microscopy. So you would not be able to see this with the naked eye. And just for scale, notice this is some protist algae here. Probably Spirogyra would be my guess from what I'm seeing. So again, something you're going to see with the microscope, but not visible to the naked eye. So I'll stop that video now. All right, so another kind of unusual feature of rotifers is something called parthenogenesis. And so they have the ability to produce offspring even when there is not a fertilization event. So parthenogenesis is when unfertilized diploid eggs develop into females. So lacking fertilization, they will still be able to produce females as long as they laid diploid eggs. Unfertilized haploid eggs will become temporary males. So degenerate means they don't live very long, they're not healthy. And so these males will live long enough to produce sperm so that you can have a fertilization event. So again, parthenogenesis is when unfertilized eggs can develop into organisms. You can get reproduction without fertilization. Diploid eggs will develop into females, and unfertilized haploid eggs will develop into temporary males. Those males produce sperm so that you can actually have sperm then fertilize a haploid egg. So a haploid egg would get fertilized and make normal offspring. So that's a way for them to get around problems in having enough organisms. Okay, and then the last two we'll talk about in this video are phylum Bryozoa and Brachiopoda. These are really small groups, so we'll just talk about them briefly. They have the lophophore feeding tentacles, which are pictured here. So this is a bryozoan. Bryozoans live in small colonies. They embed onto rock or the bottom of the ocean floor by making something called a zoocoeum. So it's almost like a shell. It's secreted by the organism and protects their body. So their body is like down inside of here, and they just stick out these tentacles to collect food. Phylum Brachiopoda is also ocean dwelling. They actually have two shells, and then out of those shells they send their lophophores for feeding, just like the bryozoans. Because they have the two shells, at a superficial glance, they almost look like mollusks, but the orientation of their shells is different. So if you think about my body, the shells would okay, so I'm going to hold my hands to the camera. So my head here, in one organism, the shells would close this way. In the brachiopods, the shell would close this way. So it's the orientation of the shells is very, very different around their bodies. So again, superficially, that might seem similar, but it's a very, very different body plan. Okay, so that's our lophophores.